Before we start, ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow travelers, I just wanted to make a special toast to Frederic Tuten. It's his birthday today.
I have to tell you that Hans Ulrich is such a mythomaniac that he's found a way to ingratiate other people into the world by claiming every time he says hello to them, it's his birthday. He tells everyone it's his birthday. He's been saying that now for 3 months. But it happened to be my birthday a few days ago. I don't know if anyone's introducing us or not. This is Hans Ulrich Obrist, the noted and wonderful curator and producer of great things in this culture. My name is Frederic Tuten. I'm a writer, a short story writer, and a novelist, and our books are there at the table, in case we forget that feature of this part of the talk. And before we start really our conversation, I wanted to read something that I wrote because I felt that just saying what trying to say it without having it on the page would be a little awkward. It wouldn't be expressive of what I really felt about Hans Ulrich's book. So let me say, first of all, to congratulate Hans Ulrich on the publication of volume 2 of his book of interviews. It's a remarkable book. I love the variety and the depth of the interviews of this book. And I think one of the pleasures in this book is learning about persons previously unknown to me, which demonstrates either my provinciality or Hans Ulrich's incredible knowledge and range, or maybe it demonstrates the both. What I like too is the feeling that in reading, or rather roaming the interviews, reading or roaming one interview to another, I don't think you have to read them sequentially. I think you just dip into it and find those pieces that you like, unknown writers and poets and artists that you've never heard of, and just see who they are. That's a great joy. But one of the nice things about this is that having the pleasure of reading these, it doesn't leave you with a feeling of letdown afterward, that sometimes you have, you know, that feeling you've read this stuff and it's over, and then you just feel, oh, you feel emptied. Why did I spend all this time reading these pieces? No, it leaves you with a great feeling that you've spent your time very fruitfully and that you've learned something, which I feel sort of, it's not true reading most fiction. Even though I'm a fiction writer, I do feel that a bit. I feel also, it sounds like a giantesque word to use, but I feel also inspired by these interviews. First, because I want to know the world of these writers and these poets and these artists better. I want to know who they are, what they've done. But also because I feel in some measure, in some strange way, they are ways of being models to myself. To say, look what they've done, look what they've thought, look what devotion they gave to their work. Why couldn't I make more of an effort? Why couldn't I do more for myself as a person, thinking, writing, etc.? Of course, this ennobling feeling does not last very long. I soon find myself back to my old self again, but the interviews remain. But more importantly, I come away with the sense that despite all appearances to the contrary, I live in a world where voices past and present form an invisible, living tissue of thought and of beauty. So, Hans Ulrich, I admire the way you're inclusive in your work, and you're not just dealing with art world people and art world figures, that you have poets and writers and people from the cinema in your book interviews, people like Nathalie Sarraute, the great French writer of the new novel, Doris Lessing, Alain Robbe-Grillet. So maybe what I can start with is to have you talk about your early and sustained love of Robert Walser, the great Swiss writer, whom I know you adore and have done a lot with. What has he meant to you as a reader? What has he meant to you in terms of your relationship to the visual arts?
Yes, Robert Walser was somehow at the very beginning, because obviously growing up in Switzerland, I came across him during my childhood. And I mean, the book, which somehow was the trigger, I would say, for the whole interview project, was a book Carl Selig did, because Robert Walser had all kinds of periods in his life. He obviously went to Berlin into exile, so that was his outer exile. His brother was a well-known painter there. Some of the books are actually collaborations between artists and writer, collaborative projects between Robert and Carl Walser. And after this first exile, he then had a fictitious exile, which was his Gazette Parisienne. It's a bit like Joseph Cornell, who never went on a grand tour. He had an imaginary grand tour. So we can say, you know, Robert Walser similarly had his imaginary grand tour. And then he went into inner exile. And he did these microscripts, and they became smaller and smaller and smaller. And ultimately, people even thought it would be a secret writing. I mean, Werner Morlang showed later on, by deciphering them heroically, it took him more than a decade of his life to decipher this microscopic writing, that it wasn't actually a secret writing, it was just really, really small. And then at the end of his life, Robert Walser wouldn't write at all anymore. He just would go on these endless walks. And I think what was very exciting is that Carl Selig, who is a Swiss literary scholar, accompanied him on these walks. And it's a book which is extraordinary because it's the last trace of these years Walser wouldn't write anymore. And it sort of made me for the first time understand to which extent maybe to record conversation can be a protest against forgetting. And I don't know if this book ever came out in English, but it's one of the greatest books of the 20th century. It's Walks with Robert Walser, and on these walks they would occasionally go to a restaurant because they obviously needed to have a drink. And my idea was then to make an homage to Robert Walser and actually dedicate a little museum to him. And I would say it's a lot of artists also. I mean, he's an artist writer, and the reason why I got to Walser is my friends Peter Fischli and David Weiss, who were among the first artists I met, they always said Robert Walser is their hero. So it's very much something which came to conversation of artists. And I think, I mean, one of the things is when we spoke about Walser earlier this afternoon, I was thinking it has somehow also to do, I suppose, with rupture and this whole idea that it's actually very much fragments which one can connect in all kinds of different ways. So this idea that it's not a linear narrative, that it's a flaneur. I mean, his books have to do with this idea of being a flaneur, and I think that was probably the main inspiration.
I like, I don't know if you've all had a chance to read this wonderful writer, late 19th century, early 20th century, Robert Walser. He's really remarkable. And he's a revelation, and came to me really because of Hans Ulrich and Fischli Weiss. When I first met them, they said to me, "Have you read Robert Walser?" I hadn't, and I had gone down very considerably in their estimation, so I had to make up for it and start reading him. One of his greatnesses, for example, is to start a novel, a novel, I think it's called The Robber. If I'm paraphrasing badly, but you tell me. It starts, Edith loves Hans, period. But more of this later. And then the rest of the book, you wait, I don't know how many pages to find out about Edith and Hans. It's wonderful. It's so inventive and charming and funny and dark as well, everything. But I really wanted to know, since we're talking about the interview book, you have a great interest in poetry. You do these poetry marathons in London at the Serpentine. I must say, it's a little awkward to say, but mostly the art world and the literary worlds, if there are really such worlds, they're very greatly separated. And there was a time, there was a tremendous interaction between them. Baudelaire and painting, and John Ashbery as a poet and writer of art reviews for art news. There was a time when artists knew each other, and I mean artists and poets knew each other and collaborated on projects and such. So I'm curious to know, you, who's been in the art world so much, what has the influence of poetry done to shape your idea of art, for example, I mean, specifically?
Yeah, you mentioned the marathon, and the marathon is actually the outcome of the collaboration with Julia Peyton-Johns, because Julia invented the pavilions and I came up with the idea of the marathon, and as Julia often says, 1 + 1 is 11. So that idea really of having each year a bridge to another discipline seems very important, and have in the pavilion a completely pluridisciplinary series of encounters. And so the poetry marathon, which we did 2 years ago, was somehow a culmination of bringing all these connections together between art and poetry. But it has built up, I think, through a lot of dialogue since the 90s. And one key moment was when Philippa Reno and I went to see the late Czesław Miłosz, who is the great Nobel Prize-winning poet in Poland. He talked a lot also about walking and the relation to poetry and walking, but also the connection to art. He actually translated Baudelaire very early on. In some kind of way, this conversation we had actually with Miloš had a lot to do, because poetry very often is linked to music, maybe more than to the visual arts, and I think because of the relationship to time. And it was very fascinating when we spoke to Miloš, the sort of whole idea, how he actually talked about collage. You know, he talked to us, he told us about Eliot.
Your speaker is, your superior, is right behind you. It's taking taking a walk.
The flânerie of the speaker here. Yeah, so basically it had all to do with this idea of wasteland, and he told us a lot about the collage, and then about his translation of Baudelaire, and the necessity really of reconnecting poetry to art, and it's something which throughout the 20th century had existed. I mean, in all the great movements of avant-garde, we had this bridge. We had it in the early 20th century. It was very strong with surrealism, where very often, I mean, I interviewed Leonora Carrington, and very often, I mean, she could be, you couldn't really say if she's a literary figure or if she's a leading visual artist. She's equally both, and that was true for many of the protagonists in the surrealist movement, and it still existed in the neo-avant-garde of the 60s. I mean, there was so many relationship between art and poetry in the 60s, and it's something which, yeah, it's kind of missing. We felt that it was missing, and I think a conversation with Cy Twombly was also key, because when I was a teenager, I went to Rome and I met Alighiero Boetti and met Cy Twombly the same day, and I learned a lot from Boetti, but I learned a lot also from Twombly. And what I learned from Twombly is that he said that he just doesn't understand why the art world isn't reading more poetry, and he also doesn't understand why there is more attention given to poets, and he felt that it would be an urgent thing, you know, if one day I would curate to take that into account. So in some kind of way, it was really Cy Twombly's message, which I've always followed ever since, and the idea is to just, whenever there is an occasion, bring poetry and art together. It means also when we do catalogs, ask poets to write for catalogs. It means very often to bring these things together. And the Poetry Marathon was obviously, from a format, special because it kind of was an endless poem. It never stopped. It was a non-stop poem because one poetry reading led to the next poetry reading. But it's something which I still consider in early days. I mean, it's much less explored maybe than the projects in relation to art and architecture. I mean, so much is talked about these days about art and architecture, art and design. It's incredibly present here in Miami. But the sort of connection to poetry, I think we need to build more in the next couple of years, and it's only just begun.
Well, one of the interviews that I like very much in your book is the interview with Alain Robbe-Grillet, the filmmaker who did Last Year at Marienbad, who wrote the script for Last Year at Marienbad, Alain René's film. And he said that he came to America and was very welcomed by the artists in America, by Rauschenberg especially, and he worked with Rauschenberg on a project. And that the reason was that, and the writers in America didn't welcome him. The writers in America weren't receptive. And he felt that the exciting thing about American artists was that they were willing to try new things, that they were willing to go beyond something that had been known before, and that most writers, and I find this is rather true today, are conventional. And the work may be wonderful, it may be interesting, it may be solid, but it doesn't have that extra quality of the daring or the innovative. And I never realized that Robbe-Grillet was so committed to that idea, and he said here that he was here in America loving all of that, loving the relationship to, it was Rauschenberg and Lichtenstein, it was some other people he liked, very much. So I never would have known that had I not read that interview in that book of yours called Volume 2 Interviews.
It's got to do with Miami somehow, this interview also, because it was actually a very extraordinary encounter which happened here just before Rauschenberg and Robbe-Grillet both died, when they met here, when Art Basel Miami honored Robert Rauschenberg, and we got Alain Robbe-Grillet here to have a conversation. And he really recorded in detail that whole friendship about 4 or 5 years ago. And indeed, I mean, the Nouveau Roman, it is very fascinating how the Nouveau Roman had a very big impact on the art world. I mean, not only did Rauschenberg literally wait when Alain Robbe-Grillet came for the first time to New York and to the States and asked him immediately to write a text, and they did a book together. I mean, that's a whole other thing, I think, which we need to revisit, which is this idea of artists and poets doing books together and doing really collaborations. But also, Michel Buteau had a huge influence. I mean, Dan Graham was always telling me to which extent the reading of Buteau was important for him and for Sol LeWitt. And so there was a very strong impact. And I think another movement which obviously I think has a strong connection to the art world and which maybe has to do with the invention of new rules of the game in literature is the Oulipo movement. I think the Oulipo movement, I mean, I've been interviewing lots of Oulipo poets, Harry Matthews, and that would be another example. But I think it's high time to turn tables and for me to ask you some questions, because this is not only the launch of Volume 2 interviews, but it's also a moment to celebrate your new book, Frederic, which you will sign after the event here.
My new book and my birthday.
Exactly.
We have to remember
and I wanted to ask you, because you in a very exemplary way, and that's one of the interviews also in volume 2, is the interview with you, have established many, many bridges between art and literature. You've had this very long-standing friendship with Roy Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein has done covers for all your books during his lifetime. So I wanted to ask you how your relationship to visual arts has started, and maybe to tell us a little bit more about your friendship to Roy.
Yeah. Well, late in the early mid-'60s, I saw one of Roy's paintings in an improbable place. It was a bar in Provincetown in New England, in Massachusetts, and it was so astonishing to see this painting of it was a man waiting in a room. I think it was a man waiting in a studio saying, "I wonder if Mr. Bellamy will like my work," or something like that. And it was so shocking. It was so shocking to see this kind of cartoon iconography, the cartoon dots, everything. And then I saw more paintings. I was astonished that this could be the vocabulary of art, that one could consider it as art. And I was really wanting to meet him, and I made every effort I could, and finally some friends did introduce me to him. We became friends until he died. He was very influential to me, and very influential not just because of the work we did together for the book jackets, which is to say, and parenthetically, the first novel is called The Adventures of Mao on the Long March, my first novel. And the cover is a head of Mao Zedong, which Roy did 2 years before Andy Warhol. I want people everywhere to know that, because it was disappointing to Roy that it was that no one really understood that Roy had done it so early and that it wasn't known. So I always want to make that. But the way that Hans Ulrich wants to tell that my birthday every day, I always find a way to say that Roy did this earlier than Warhol. I think what happened with Roy and me was that I thought about. Well, in specific, I thought about how one can use cartoon figures for books, for fiction. And I think that really was one of the things that moved me to write this novel called Tintin in the New World, which is a novel about that Belgian comic strip artist, that beautiful Belgian boy reporter, Tuten. So there was lots of ways in which Roy's work and Roy's thinking sort of moved me, much more than even reading other fictions. I think it was really his work, the painting, that mattered to me a lot.
And you mentioned Tenten, and Hergé is obviously another wonderful dialogue you've had. Hergé died in the early 80s, but you met him. Can you tell us about your meetings with Hergé? Because it's something I always wanted to ask you.
I hope we had enough time. I became friends with Alain Resnais, whom I dedicated this book to, this book called Self-Portraits Fictions. He's now 87 years old, by the way, and he's still making films. He's remarkable. He's really an inspiration. And I think you've got to interview him, really. You must interview him soon. And I had just met Resnais, and he asked me what I was reading. And I said, well, I'm reading these Tintin books, these Tintin children's books. I thought he was going to say, what a waste of time. And he said, which period? I said, what period of what? He said, well, which period of Tintin? You know, there are different periods. There's a black and white period. And I only knew the most recent. And I said, we talked about it a lot. And I told him how much I loved it, how I loved the continuity of the images, the narrative drive. It was just beautiful. And I said, it's too bad that Hergé is dead. And he said, that's so interesting. He said, I just got a postcard from him 3 months ago. Well, I said, well, when I was in Paris, I went to the stores. I bought every book I could find, because in America there weren't that many to find. I read every single one of them. I called Casterman, Hergé's publisher, and I asked if I could interview him. And the man said, it must have been my French. The man said, well, Hergé is dead. He said his nephew is carrying on the tradition, but I don't think that he'd be interested in meeting you. What a perverse thing to tell me. Anyway, I thought he was dead, and that was the end of it. But then Resnais said, no, he's not dead. In fact, he's coming here next week. Would you like to meet him? I said, absolutely. Resnais had never met him. Resnais had started a film project with Hergé for one of the albums called the Ile Noire, the Black Island, but they had never met. It was one of those film projects, like so many, that begin and then just die. They've never got made. But anyway, he said, I'll let him know that you were going to meet him. There was a party, a reception. I met him. He was adorable. The first thing he said to me is, Alain Resnais says that you like my work. Pause. Why? That was tough. And I said, just spontaneously, I said, well, I love the way the color of your nighttime blue. The nighttime blue is ravishing. And he said, oh, that's really nice. And then he said, it's my wife who colors the blue. So he was very, very happy in some way. Anyway, we had a long relationship, and again, until he died. It's unfortunate when you have older friends and you love them a lot, you know, and then they're not there, and they're not replaceable, irreplaceable. But anyway, we became very good friends, and I loved those books, and I was fascinated by Tuten as a character and his innocence and his wiliness as well, all of it. And I asked his permission if I could use the characters for my novel, and without anything, he said, of course. And then he sent me a letter about a week later, and I had the characters in my, my world, and I could use them. So so I would say Liechtenstein for a certain kind of vocabulary, and Hergé for iconography, and it's
But I'm always very surprised that each time we meet, there is, other artists you mentioned with whom you've had dialogues with. It's a very, very long list, basically, of artists with whom you've worked, on whom you've written. And in terms of a protest against forgetting, I thought it would be nice to talk about your Brazilian friend. You told me yesterday, Wesley.
Oh, God, it's so painful. It was my birthday yesterday, as it was the day before. But yesterday, we were having a kind of quick coffee thing with John Baldessari and some people, and one was a Brazilian curator from Rio. And I said to him, oh, listen, just tell me, how is my old friend Wesley Duke Lee? He said he died. That put me in kind of shock, because Wesley Duke Lee is probably unknown here, but he was a wonderful artist, and an innovative, interesting, lived in Sao Paulo. I mean, we're so naive. We don't know so much about that world, really, I'm afraid to say, ashamed to say. But he was so wonderful. He did things with machines, and he made canvases with moving parts. It was extraordinary. And then I got over that shock, and I said to him, what about my friend Rubens Gershman? He said he died 3 months ago. So it's strange, to feel these worlds vanishing. And that's why, to go back to Hans Ulrich, I think that the interview project is so important. These voices have to be given to us. We have to inherit them. And I think that this work that you've been doing, these 2 volumes, which is a beginning of, I hope, many, many more, is very valuable to our culture. We have to have this as a memory. We can't let the past just die and vanish, and these voices vanish. So anyway, my relationship with the art world was started very early, and I'm passionate about painting, and I'm passionate about art, and I would love to have all my fellow writers and poets open up a little bit more to that.
Now, you've also written a lot, because you've mentioned John Baldessari. You've written on him. I had breakfast with him this morning, and we talked about you. Can you tell us about the dialogue with him and the text you wrote?
Well, I was asked to write something for the Guggenheim catalog for a Baldessari show. And I love his work very much. I've known it for a long time. I started to see it when I was in California in the 60s. And I thought, I just don't want to, I can't really write kind of art critical stuff. I know it's very close to fiction, and I shouldn't be frightened of it. Just make lies and it'll be okay if you tell the lies elegantly. I'm sorry to say this. We can go into that a long time. But I thought, I don't want to do the iconography of the images and the flattening of the surface, all that stuff. Anyone can say that. So I went into the archives. I found every interview he ever made, anything, your interview. And I started to piece together, like a collage, pieces of the interviews, to which I asked the questions. So I would say, John, in 1956 you took movie stills and did that. What are you still doing it? And all of a sudden he'd have another answer. But that answer all came from his old interviews. We never met. We had never spoken. So it was a kind of collage, of a living voice with stuff that was there. I don't know how he would take it, but it seemed he liked it. And we sort of, liked each other because of it. That was very nice. I wish we had more time just to say this one thing. There's an essay, I don't know if Hans Ulrich knows it. It's called The Death of Literature by a French critic scholar called Jacques Herman, who died very young. Speaking of death, it's too bad you didn't interview him. It's always the intellectual who wants to see the end of literature or the end of art, it seems to me. Albert Camus said, the shoemaker never wants to kill Shakespeare. It's always the intellectual who wants the end of the book, end of painting, the end of literature, end of this. This is the end of literature. I don't know how I'm getting to this. I'm going to try to get to a point. His point is, we have enough books. We don't need any more books. We have enough books. They're in the libraries are filled with books. In all our lifetimes, we can start with A, we'd never get to B. So he says, we don't have to make more books. Let's use the old books like fertilizer and make new books. He said, just take shreds of books, put them together, make collages, and you have a text. So I'm thinking that's the thing with interviews. I'm sorry to say. Don't make new interviews. Use the old ones and recombine them.
which is actually great, because it ties very much in with what we try to do with the Institute of the 21st Century and the Venice project with Sejima, and also the University in Karlsruhe, when actually the digital archive of my interviews with Cedric Price was not only digitized but also tagged. And all of a sudden, lots of new interviews can actually happen with these existing interviews, and Cedric is somehow again alive. So that
perfect.
was a kind of
an
experiment.
But wait, before we forget, I have a question to ask. I think we may all want to know this. Was there anyone, a writer say, that you wanted to interview and couldn't? Not that the person was dead, I mean that you couldn't?
Yes, I mean there has been an almost failed interview which was sort of partially unrealized, which was the interview with the great science fiction writer Stanislav Lem in Krakow, when Johanna Mikowska and I visited him, and I asked him the wrong question, because he wrote Solaris, and I asked him what he thought about Tarkovsky's film, Solaris, and he turned all red, and he said, his mother said one should never talk badly about a dead person, but Tarkovsky, no, and he started to say terrible things about Tarkovsky. And he stood up and he brought us to the door and he called a taxi, and we stood in the snow. So that was a kind of a drama. But then there was the situation with David Markson, which you were involved. David
I'm
Markson
sorry for laughing so
being
much.
one of the great writers of the 20th century. And I wrote him a letter, but maybe you should tell the story.
Well, David Markson, now, why are we speaking about dead people? He died about 7 months or 8 months ago, in 86. He had a nice life. He wrote very interesting books. You really should know about these really interesting books. One is called This Is Not a Novel. One is called A Reader's Block. One is called Vanishing. What he did was make, I mean, they're not quotes, but he put pieces of things together and made autobiographies out of them. They're ravishing. He would find things about poets' death, or striking little things about illnesses of things. It's a kind of collage, but it becomes a very, you don't see the narrator is invisible, but the story is there in some way. Hans Ulrich, who knows lots of things about people one never knows about, in this case he knew about David Markson. Again, now people very, very seldom understood in the culture. And he said, I want to interview him, do you know him? I said, yes. So I phoned Markson. I said, my good friend, wonderful Hans-Ulrich Obrist. I told him all about Hans-Ulrich. I said, I'm very, very busy now. Have him write to me. And then I hear nothing, and Hans-Ulrich writes and says to me, I wrote to him. He says he's very busy. Can you do anything? So I call him again. I said, please, he's coming to New York. He's very seldom here. You should meet him. And he said, I don't know. I'm too busy. Then the third time this happens, the phone rings, and he calls me. And I said, David, is everything okay? Tell your friend Hans-Ulrich Obrist not to write to me anymore. Tell him not to call me anymore. Leave me alone. I'm too old to be bothered. He sent me a catalog of John Chamberlain. He wrote, was that the John Chamberlain text?
It's the book, the interview with
It's
John
the book of interview with John Chamberlain. He said, I hate John Chamberlain. Why does he send me a book of John Chamberlain? And that was the end. He said, tell him not to come near me again. That was one of the failed interviews, I think. But it was so hilarious. He hated John. And in his book, by the way, in This Is Not a Novel, this is really why, and I like him, but imagine what he wrote. He said, if there's a building, and the building's on fire, and you can save a cat or a Liechtenstein painting, next thing he said, take the cat. But you can see his ideas weren't exactly enlightened about that, but he was a brilliant writer.
There could not be a better conclusion with that story of David Markson, and really of all of you who haven't read David Markson, it's a true revelation to read this author. And so now we have a double or actually multiple book signing, because Frederic will sign his book and I will sign the interview book, and we have also some of the artists here. I see Pedro Reyes, so it will be a collective book signing. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hans.